On the evening of August 7th, 1974, a family gathered in the White House for the last time. Someone took photographs. In the photographs, they are smiling. She is smiling. The woman who had given 30 years to this house, to this man, to this life she had never quite chosen. Composed, dignified, unreadable as always. She looked at those photographs afterward, and she said 7 words. Our hearts were breaking, and there we are, smiling. This is the story of Patricia Ryan Nixon, the most admired woman in America, who history almost forgot completely. There is a photograph that very few people have seen closely. It was taken on the evening of August 7th, 1974, in the solarium of the White House. The lighting is warm, the family is gathered, and they are smiling, all of them, together, for the last time in that house. The woman in the photograph is wearing a pale dress. Her hair is set perfectly. Her posture is, as always, composed. She has her arm around her husband's shoulder, and she is looking at the camera with the expression she had perfected over 30 years of public life. Open, dignified, and utterly unreadable. She would later look at that photograph and say 7 words that tell you everything you need to know about who she was. Our hearts were breaking, and there we are, smiling. Welcome. My name is your narrator, and this is Quiet Sovereigns, a series about the people who never wore the crown but paid the price of every throne they stood beside. Tonight, we tell the story of Patricia Ryan Nixon. History remembers Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, the man who opened China, the man who resigned in disgrace, the man whose name became shorthand for political betrayal. History has never quite known what to do with his wife. She was called Plastic Pat by the press, cold, artificial, a smile without a soul behind it. She was ranked the most admired woman in America 14 times by the Gallup poll. She was the most traveled First Lady in United States history. She was the first president's wife to enter a combat zone, the first to serve as an official diplomatic representative abroad, the first to publicly support the Equal Rights Amendment and a woman's right to choose, in an era when her own husband's party did neither. And yet, when the helicopter lifted off from the south lawn of the White House on the morning of August 9, 1974, carrying away the disgraced president and his family, the cameras followed Richard Nixon. They always had. Nobody really watched her. This is the story of a woman who gave everything to a life she never chose, who loved a man deeply and was, without malice, without intention, but completely, kept in the dark by the very machinery that surrounded him, who smiled when her heart was breaking and never once asked anyone to notice. Tonight, we go back to a small farm in Artesia, California. We go back to a girl who had already lost everything once and survived. And we follow her forward, through the years that made her, and the years that unmade everything she had built. This is Pat Nixon, and this is what they never told you. The town of Ely, Nevada, in the year 1912, was not a place that promised much. It was a copper mining town, raw and dusty, carved into the high desert at an elevation where winters arrived early and stayed long. The men who worked there came up from the ground each evening with dark rings around their eyes and the particular kind of exhaustion that lives in the bones. They did not talk much about the future. The future in Ely was a luxury. It was here, in the early hours of March 16th, that a miner named William Ryan came home before dawn and found that his wife had given birth to a daughter. He held the baby girl and called her his St. Patrick's babe in the morn, because St. Patrick's Day was only hours away, and because his Irish blood had always needed to claim something as its own. The name on the birth certificate would read Thelma Catherine Ryan. But from that first morning, her father called her Pat. She would answer to that name for the rest of her life. The Ryan family did not stay in Ely long. When Pat was still a toddler, her parents packed what they had and moved south and west to the edge of Los Angeles County, to a small patch of land near a town called Artesia. Her father bought 10 acres and attempted what so many men of that era attempted: a truck farm, a piece of American soil that might yield something back if you worked it hard enough. There was no indoor plumbing. There was no electricity. There were 2 older brothers, Tom and Bill, and the particular arithmetic of a large family with very little money. Everyone worked, everyone contributed, and no one complained, because complaining changed nothing. What shaped Pat Ryan in those early years was not hardship exactly. It was endurance. The learned knowledge that difficulty was not an emergency. It was simply the weather. She was good at school, in the way that children who have nothing else to prove tend to be. Quietly, thoroughly good, without making a display of it. She loved to read. She was popular with her classmates in the uncomplicated way of someone who pays genuine attention to people around her. Her teachers remembered her as bright and self-contained. Her brothers remembered her as the one who kept the household running without being asked. And then, when Pat was 13 years old, her mother died. Kate Ryan had been ill for some time, a slow illness, the kind that hollows a house out gradually, that makes children tiptoe and speak in low voices. When she was gone, Pat did not tiptoe anymore. There was no time for it. She was the only girl in the family, and the house needed someone to run it. Her father was exhausted and grieving and had 10 acres to tend. Her brothers were older but needed feeding. Pat cooked. Pat cleaned. Pat managed what needed managing, with a practicality that had nothing to do with age. She was 13. 5 years later, her father was gone too. William Ryan died of tuberculosis in the spring of 1930, after months of illness that Pat had largely nursed him through herself. She was 18 years old. She had 2 older brothers, a small farm, and no one left to ask for anything. She was, in the most literal sense, alone. What she did next tells you more about who she was than almost anything that followed. She did not stop. She worked. She found jobs, multiple, overlapping, unglamorous, to pay her way through college. She worked as a telephone operator. She worked as a janitor sweeping office floors. She worked as a pharmacy manager. She earned a qualification as a radiographer and administered X-rays at a hospital in New York, where she had gone briefly with relatives. She returned to California, enrolled at the University of Southern California, and continued working. She graduated cum laude in 1937, teaching credential in hand, debt behind her, future somewhere ahead. She had remade herself entirely from the wreckage of her first 18 years. She had done it quietly, without spectacle, without anyone to witness or applaud. This, too, was a pattern that would repeat. She took a teaching job at Whittier High School and settled into the modest rhythms of a life that was, for the first time, her own. She had a small salary. She had colleagues. She had the particular relief of a person who has been through the worst and arrived on the other side. She was 25 years old, and she was, finally, at rest. It was at a local theater audition in the winter of 1937 that she met a young lawyer named Richard Nixon. He was playing opposite her in a production called The Dark Tower. He was compact, dark-haired, intensely earnest in the manner of someone who has decided to be earnest as a strategy. He fell in love with her that first evening, Completely, almost comically, with the wholehearted certainty of a man who has found the one thing he was looking for and cannot understand why it might not be immediately obvious to the object of his affection. Pat was not interested, not at first. She had worked too hard for too long to give herself easily to anyone. She had friends, she had dates. She was not, as some have characterized her, a woman simply waiting for a man to arrive and organize her life. She had organized her life herself. She did not need reorganizing. But Richard Nixon was persistent in the way that only a particular kind of man can be, the kind who mistakes stubbornness for virtue and calls it devotion. He drove her to Los Angeles for dates with other men because he did not want her to travel alone on the streetcar. He wrote her letters. He showed up. Over 2 years, he wore down her caution with something that looked, to Pat Ryan, enough like sincerity that she finally agreed to marry him. They were wed on June 21st, 1940, in a simple ceremony at the Mission Inn in Riverside, California. Pat wore a blue suit. There was no reception. They spent their honeymoon camping. 2 years later, the war came. Richard Nixon joined the Navy and shipped out to the South Pacific. Pat went to San Francisco and took a job with the Office of Price Administration because there was work to be done, and she had never been the kind of person who waited for things to happen to her. They were separated for 14 months, an ocean between them, and only letters to Bridget. They wrote to each other every day. In his memoir, Richard Nixon would later recall those months with a plain, uncharacteristic tenderness. Letters from home were the only thing we really had to look forward to. Pat saved every letter he sent her for the rest of her life, all of them, numbered carefully, because the mail was unreliable, and they had agreed to number each one so they would know if something was lost. The letters he sent her were, by any measure, remarkable. He wrote to her about the heat and the boredom and the fear, yes, but also about the future they were going to build together, and about the quality of her presence in his life with a directness that he would never quite manage again in public. "I just had to write you," she wrote back in 1942, "to say how very much I love you." This is what they were, before politics, before cameras, before everything. Two people who wrote to each other across an ocean, numbering the letters so nothing would be lost. It would be a long time before Pat Ryan Nixon understood how much would be lost anyway. Richard Nixon came home from the war with plans. That was the word Pat would use later, in quieter moments. Plans. He had always had them, even before the war, even when they were just two people in a community theater reading lines opposite each other. But the war had sharpened something in him. He came back from the South Pacific with a specific hunger, not for wealth, not exactly for power, but for the thing that both of those represent: significance. He wanted to matter. He wanted to be in the room where it happened. Pat understood this about him. She had married him, after all, with her eyes open. She was not naive. She had simply believed, somewhere in the early years of their marriage, that she would be a partner in whatever came next. That the woman who had rebuilt herself from nothing would have a voice in the life they were building together. In 1946, Richard Nixon ran for Congress. Pat was at his side. She had not been consulted about the decision. She had simply been informed of it. And being the woman she was, she had set down whatever she was doing and gotten to work. She learned the mechanics of a campaign. She addressed envelopes. She attended rallies. She gave informal speeches to women's groups when asked. And she was good at it. Better, some said, than her husband. Because she had a gift for making people feel genuinely seen that he never quite possessed. She was warm in the way that cannot be performed. She simply was. He won in 1946. He won again in 1948. In 1950, he was elected to the Senate. In each campaign, Pat was there, organizing, traveling, shaking hands, smiling through evenings that stretched until midnight in high school gymnasiums and church halls across California. She did this while raising two daughters, Tricia and Julie. She did this without a staff, without resources, without anything resembling the infrastructure that would later surround them. She did it because she had promised him she would. And Pat Nixon kept her promises. But there was a cost, and she knew it. She had wanted a quiet life. She had said so to the few people she trusted enough to say it to. Her close friend Helene Drown, in letters that were direct in a way she never was in public. She had wanted a home, a family, a door she could close on the world when the world became too much. Politics was the opposite of a closed door. Politics was the world forcing itself into your kitchen, your living room, your children's bedrooms. Politics was waking up one morning and discovering that your family's finances were being broadcast on national television. That morning came in September of 1952. Richard Nixon had been selected as Dwight Eisenhower's running mate, the vice presidential nominee on the Republican ticket. It was a sudden and enormous elevation, the kind that happens to a certain type of ambitious man and seems, in retrospect, almost inevitable. Pat had been against it. She had thought, after 6 years of campaigns, that the Senate was enough, that they could stop here, settle into something more stable, something that left room for her to be more than a satellite in her husband's orbit. She had almost convinced him. Then she heard the announcement from a news bulletin at the Republican National Convention. She did not make a scene. She was Pat Nixon. She adjusted. Weeks later, accusations surfaced that Nixon had maintained an illegal slush fund from campaign donors. The story threatened to end his career before it had truly begun. Eisenhower's team pressured Nixon to address the charges publicly or leave the ticket. Nixon chose to address them. On national television, in a broadcast that would reach 60 million Americans on a Tuesday night in September. He did not tell Pat what he was going to say. She sat beside him on the stage at the El Capitan Theater in Hollywood, in a neat dark dress, and she watched her husband talk about their finances, their mortgage, their savings, their debts, with the fixed expression of someone absorbing information they are hearing for the first time. Because she was. Pat Nixon later recalled that her intense gaze at the camera that night was simply because she wanted to hear what he would say. She did not know in advance. On 60 million television screens across America, it looked like devotion. It was also something else. Nixon spoke about their money, the car, the house, the borrowed against life insurance policy. He noted, pointedly, that his wife did not own a mink coat. But she does have a respectable Republican cloth coat, he said, and I always tell her she'd look good in anything. The audience loved it. The nation responded. The speech saved Nixon's place on the ticket, launched his national profile, and made Pat Nixon, for the first time, a public figure in her own right. She hated it. Not the outcome. Not her husband's survival on the ticket. What she hated was the exposure, the sense of having been displayed, her private life itemized and broadcast to justify someone else's ambition. She had not chosen this. She had not been asked. And the moment that made her a household name was a moment in which she had no voice whatsoever. It takes heart to be in political life, she said once, with the particular economy of a woman who has learned to compress large feelings into small sentences. The years that followed were a kind of sustained endurance. Vice President Nixon, Then the presidential campaign of 1960 against a young senator from Massachusetts named John Kennedy. Pat had traveled with her husband through thousands of miles of campaign trail, 8 campaigns in 14 years. She was exhausted in a way that goes below the physical, the kind of exhaustion that settles into a person's relationship with hope. Nixon lost in 1960 by a margin so narrow it still aches in the telling. Pat allowed herself, briefly, to believe it was over. They moved to California. Nixon declared he was done with politics. She exhaled for the first time in years. She made a home. She planted a garden. She was, for a short window, simply a woman living her life. Then came 1962 and a gubernatorial race in California, and another loss. This one more bitter, more public, ending with her husband telling reporters at a press conference that they won't have Nixon to kick around anymore. And then came 1968. He told her he wanted to try again. One more time. The presidency, the thing he had always wanted, the thing she had spent 20 years helping him reach for. Pat looked at the man she had married. Older now, grayer, carrying the particular weight of someone who has been publicly humiliated and survived it. And she said yes. She said yes because she loved him. She said yes because she had always said yes. She said yes because somewhere in the 30 years since a young lawyer had driven her to Los Angeles for dates with other men, because he didn't want her to take the streetcar alone, she had bound her life to his so completely that the word no had lost its meaning between them. She said yes. And in November of 1968, Richard Nixon was elected the 37th President of the United States. Pat Nixon became First Lady of the United States at 56 years old. She had earned it in every sense that word can carry. Through campaigns and defeats and late nights and cloth coats and the long, grinding labor of being the woman beside the man. What she could not yet know was that the hardest part had not yet begun. May 18th. The White House, in January of 1969, smelled of fresh paint and cut flowers. Pat Nixon walked through the private quarters on her first full day as First Lady and made mental notes, not of what was beautiful, but of what needed doing. This was her nature. She did not stand in the center of a room and admire it. She stood in the center of a room and identified what was missing, what was worn, what could be better. And then she got to work. What followed, over the next 5 years, was one of the most ambitious and least celebrated restoration projects in White House history. Pat Nixon added more than 600 paintings, antiques, and period furnishings to the Executive Mansion's collections, the largest single acquisition effort by any administration, before or since. She hired Clement Conger as curator and worked alongside him, with the focus of someone who understood that the White House was not just a residence, but a monument, and that it deserved to be treated as one. She opened the White House to more visitors than any previous administration. She arranged for the exterior to be illuminated at night, the way the Lincoln Memorial was illuminated, because she thought it should glow, that people driving past at midnight should be able to see it. She did all of this without a press secretary of her own for the first 2 years. She did all of this while managing a household that included a president, 2 daughters, a rotating cast of state visitors, and the permanent, exhausting theater of public life. She did all of this while the West Wing, the men who ran her husband's administration, treated her schedule, her initiatives, and her presence as secondary concerns. This is the part of the story that the cameras missed entirely. According to biographer Heath Hardage Lee, the relationship between Pat Nixon and her husband's senior staff, chief among them H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's chief of staff, was one of managed exclusion. Haldeman and his deputy, John Ehrlichman, whom Nixon himself privately called the Germans, controlled access to the president with a thoroughness that extended to his wife. Pat's requests for joint appearances, for input on policy matters where her experience was directly relevant, for the kind of partnership in governance that some first ladies had historically exercised. These requests moved through channels that had a way of going quiet. She was not ignored because she was unworthy of attention. She was sidelined because attention, in that White House, was a currency controlled by men who had not included her in their accounting. What the public saw instead was the version of Pat Nixon they had always seen: composed, elegant, tireless. She traveled to more than 80 countries as First Lady and as Second Lady combined. She was the first presidential spouse to visit a combat zone when she accompanied her husband to Vietnam in 1969. In 1970, she flew alone to Peru after a devastating earthquake, carrying relief supplies on behalf of the United States government, and the Peruvian government awarded her the Grand Cross of the Order of the Sun, their highest honor. 30 years before it would become a celebrated act of royal compassion, Pat Nixon shook hands with patients suffering from leprosy. She tapped her feet and danced with them. Richard Nixon told a reporter afterward that Pat's visits with those patients made a greater impression than anything I did or said on that entire trip. The press called her Plastic Pat. The disconnect is almost too large to hold. Here was a woman who had, by any objective measure, expanded the role of First Lady in ways both substantive and symbolic, who had a diplomat's instinct for genuine human connection, who had traveled to places that most of her predecessors had never considered, who had sat with the sick and the grieving and the dispossessed and made them feel, briefly, that the United States of America had not forgotten them. And the prevailing narrative, the one that circulated in newspapers and magazine profiles and the casual conversation of a politically engaged public, was that she was cold, artificial, a woman performing the role of a person. She knew what they said about her. She had been hearing versions of it for 20 years. "I am who I am," she said once, "and I will continue to be." There is no self-pity in that sentence. There is also no yielding. The truth was more complicated than either her critics or her admirers acknowledged. Pat Nixon was not the plastic figure the press had constructed, nor quite the saintly martyr that later sympathetic accounts would sometimes make her. She was a woman of strong opinions who had learned, over decades of political life, that expressing those opinions publicly created problems she would be left to manage alone. She supported the Equal Rights Amendment. She believed a woman should have the right to make her own decisions about her body. According to historian Heath Hardage Lee, she held these views clearly and consistently, and held them privately, because the political calculus of her husband's administration could not accommodate them. She was, in this as in so many things, invisible where it mattered most. What sustained her in those White House years were the things no photographer caught. The unannounced visits to the public rooms, where she would slip in among the tourists and answer questions and shake hands until her staff found her and guided her back upstairs. The letters she wrote, personal notes, handwritten, to people who had no particular claim on her attention except that they had written to her first. The friendship with Helene Drown, who had known her since before the campaigns, who knew the woman behind the composed public face, to whom Pat could say the things she could not say anywhere else. And there was her husband. Their marriage, in those years, was a complicated and private thing. The great love story of the early years, the war letters, the numbered envelopes crossing the Pacific. "I just had to write you to say how very much I love you." had become something different by the time they reached the White House. Not cold, not broken, but transformed, in the way that all long marriages transform, by the weight of shared history and divergent need. Richard Nixon was a man who found emotional intimacy difficult in direct proportion to how much he needed it. He was capable of tenderness, genuinely, privately capable of it. In March of 1969, months into his presidency, he summoned Pat's social secretary to a private meeting in the White House and spent an hour describing, in minute detail, his plans for a surprise birthday party for his wife. He was so animated during the planning, according to those present, that he sang the entirety of Happy Birthday in the meeting. He had her favorite foods arranged. He had her favorite flowers. He wanted everything to be perfect. He was also a man who had built an administration around advisors who treated his wife as peripheral. Both of these things were true. And Pat Nixon lived inside the space between them, loving a man who loved her, in a house that had no room for her, in a city that had decided, before she arrived, who she was. She smiled, she traveled, she restored the furniture, she wrote the thank you notes. And somewhere, in the West Wing, the men her husband trusted were recording everything. Every meeting, every conversation, every unguarded word spoken in those painted rooms. Pat Nixon did not know this, not yet. In the summer of 1972, Pat Nixon was voted the most admired woman in America. It was the 12th time she had appeared on the Gallup poll's list of most admired women. 12 times. More than any other first lady then living. More than most women in public life, period. The American people, the ones who actually saw her, who stood in line to shake her hand at the White House, who watched her dance with school children in Liberia and comfort earthquake survivors in Peru. Those people had decided, repeatedly and without ambiguity, that they admired her. That same summer, 5 men broke into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. Pat Nixon learned about the break-in the way most Americans did, from the newspapers. This is not a small detail. This is, in many ways, the detail that unlocks everything. She was the First Lady of the United States. She lived in the same house as the President. She had been beside him through 30 years of political life, through 8 campaigns, through defeats and comebacks, through the McCarthy era and the Checkers speech, and the loss to Kennedy, and the long climb back. She knew his habits, his fears, his particular brand of defensive pride. She knew him in the way that only a person who has shared a bed and a life with someone for 3 decades can know them. And she did not know about Watergate. Not from him. Not from anyone in that building. "I know only what I read in the newspapers," she told the press when they asked her about the break-in in those early months. It was the truth. And the truth was devastating. Not because of what it revealed about her husband, but because of what it revealed about her position in his world. She was the last person to know. The most loyal person in that administration, the one who had given more of herself to Richard Nixon's career than anyone else alive, was the one they had least trusted with the truth. The months that followed were a slow unwinding. Watergate grew from a story about a break-in to a story about a cover-up, to a story about the systematic corruption of an entire administration. Names emerged. Testimony was given. Haldeman, Ehrlichman. The men who had managed Pat out of the room for 5 years were now managing the collapse of everything from the inside. Pat watched it happen the way she had watched most of the defining moments of her political life, from a position of proximity without power. She was close enough to feel everything. She was not close enough to change anything. She believed in her husband's innocence. This is documented clearly by everyone who knew her in that period. By Julie, by her friends, by the few journalists she permitted access. She was not a woman performing loyalty while privately suspecting the worst. She genuinely believed that the man she had married was not capable of what he was being accused of. She had built her life on that belief. It was not something she could afford to examine too closely. When reporters cornered her with questions about whether the press was responsible for the president's problems, she shot back, "What problems?" She was not performing. She was protecting. And then came the tapes. It emerged in the summer of 1973 that Richard Nixon had installed a secret recording system in the White House. Microphones in the Oval Office, in the Cabinet Room, in the Executive Office Building. Every conversation, every meeting, every unguarded word spoken in those rooms for years had been captured and preserved on tape. Pat Nixon did not know. Her daughter Julie would later state this plainly. The First Lady had no knowledge of the recording system's existence. Had she known, Julie said, her mother would have ordered the tapes destroyed immediately. When Pat finally learned of the tapes, from the news, again, from the newspapers, again, she did not rage. She did not weep in public. She did not grant an interview or issue a statement. What she did was look at the fact of it, quietly, and arrive at a conclusion that tells you everything about who she was. She called the tapes private love letters for one person alone. Private love letters. This is the sentence that stops you if you sit with it long enough. The recordings were not love letters. They were evidence. They were, as it turned out, the instrument of her husband's destruction. The thing that proved what he had done, that made denial impossible, that forced the resignation that ended everything. And Pat Nixon, who had not known they existed, who had been kept entirely outside the circle of that secret, looked at those tapes and called them love letters. Because that is what she needed them to be. Because the alternative, that the man she had given 30 years to had built a secret architecture of deception inside the house they shared, was not something she could hold and remain standing. She was not naive. She was surviving. The pressure of those months is difficult to describe from the outside. The White House became a besieged place. Staff departing, investigations deepening, the daily rhythm of public life continuing in the foreground, while in the background, everything was coming apart. Pat continued her schedule. She appeared at events. She smiled for photographs. She wrote her thank you notes. Julie would later say that Watergate was the only crisis that ever truly broke her mother. That all the campaigns, all the defeats, all the years of exhaustion and displacement had not done what Watergate did. And yet from the outside, watching her move through those months, you would not have known it. This was the genius and the tragedy of Pat Nixon. She had been trained by a childhood of loss, by her mother's death at 13, her father's at 18. By years of working multiple jobs to pay for an education no one was going to give her. To keep moving. To keep her face composed. To not let the thing that was breaking her show in her expression. She had been practicing that particular skill for 60 years. By the summer of 1974, it was clear that the presidency was ending. The tapes had been subpoenaed. The transcripts had been published. The articles of impeachment were being drawn up. One by one, the men who had surrounded Richard Nixon were gone, resigned, indicted, departing in the night. Pat still believed he should fight. She urged him not to resign, to face the impeachment process, to make his case, to refuse to yield. According to Julie, she was almost alone in this. His political advisors, his lawyers, even his daughters could see that the end was inevitable. Pat could not accept it, or would not. On the evening of August 7, 1974, the Nixon family gathered for dinner in the solarium of the White House. It was their last dinner there. Everyone in the room understood this, although it had not yet been said aloud to Pat. Richard Nixon told his family that night that he would resign the following morning. He walked into the solarium, and Pat threw her arms around him and kissed him and said, "We're all very proud of you, Daddy." Someone took photographs. In the photographs, they are smiling. All of them. Pat, Richard, the daughters, the sons-in-law. Composed, dignified, together. The lighting in the solarium was warm that evening. The White House was beautiful, as it always was. Pat Nixon looked at those photographs afterward and described them with 7 words that she had earned the right to say. Our hearts were breaking, and there we are, smiling. On the morning of August 9, 1974, Richard Nixon stood in the East Room of the White House and gave a farewell address to his staff. He read from Theodore Roosevelt's biography. He praised his parents. He spoke about his mother, a saint, he called her, and his voice broke visibly in front of the cameras and the assembled staff and his family. It was one of the most raw and uncomfortable displays of public emotion that many of those present had ever witnessed from him, a man who had spent his entire career building walls between himself and the watching world. Finally, in the moment of total defeat, unable to hold the walls up. Pat stood behind him. Her face, in the footage from that morning, is almost impossible to look at directly. Not because it shows grief, though it does if you know where to look, but because it shows the effort of not showing grief. The chin held at a precise angle. The eyes focused on a point slightly above the horizon. The mouth set in the expression she had been perfecting since she was 13 years old and standing in a kitchen that needed running, and there was no one left to run it but her. She had told her daughter afterward that what upset her most in those final moments was the cameras. Not the departure itself, not the resignation. The cameras, because they were recording her anguish, as they had recorded everything, and she had not consented to this particular intimacy. She had never consented to any of it, really. The family walked out across the south lawn together, Pat and Richard, their daughters, their sons-in-law, toward the waiting helicopter, Marine One. Reporters and cameras lined the path. Richard Nixon paused at the door of the helicopter and turned and raised both arms in the double V sign that had become his trademark gesture. Defiant, strange, oddly triumphant for a man who was leaving in disgrace. Photographs of that moment would become iconic. They would appear in history books and documentaries and retrospectives for decades. In almost none of those photographs do you see Pat. She had stopped just before he turned. She had looked, briefly, just briefly, back at the White House. And then she looked away. Before she boarded the helicopter, she turned to Betty Ford, who was standing there with her husband, who would be sworn in as president within hours, and said the last thing she would ever say to a White House that had taken 30 years of her life. "You'll see many of these red carpets," she told Betty Ford, "and you'll get so you hate 'em. 30 years, 8 campaigns, thousands of red carpets, thousands of handshakes, thousands of evenings in gymnasiums and hotel ballrooms and foreign capitals. Compressed, at the end, into one sentence to a woman she barely knew. The helicopter lifted. Below her, the White House grew small, and then smaller, and then it was gone. They settled in San Clemente, California, at the estate called La Casa Pacifica, the House of Peace, although there was very little peace in it at first. Richard Nixon was fighting legal battles, facing potential prosecution, consumed by the aftermath of his own undoing. The phone rang constantly. Lawyers came and went. The world, which had been watching his fall with ferocious attention, continued to watch. Pat withdrew. In the 5.5 years they spent in California, she made exactly one solo public appearance. In May of 1975, she traveled to her girlhood hometown of Artesia to dedicate a new elementary school that had been named after her. She stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled crowd. Schoolchildren, local officials, people who had known her family, people who had driven from elsewhere just to see her. And she said, with the particular dry humor of someone who has learned to find comedy in dark places, "I'm proud to have the school carry my name. I always thought that only those who have gone had schools named after them. I am happy to tell you that I'm not gone. I mean, not really gone." The crowd laughed. Pat smiled. She did not make another public appearance for years. She was in the garden instead, planting, tending, kneeling in the California soil in dark trousers. Dark, her daughter Julie confided once, so the stains on her knees won't show. This small detail, more than almost anything else recorded from those years, catches something true about her. Still managing appearances. Still, even alone in a garden with no cameras and no audience, concerned with the presentation of a life that had always been watched. Old habits do not die simply because the watching stops. On July 7, 1976, Pat Nixon was at La Casa Pacifica when she suffered a stroke. The paralysis took her entire left side. She recovered, slowly, through months of physical therapy that she described in one of her rare remarks about her own suffering as the hardest thing I have ever done physically. She had buried her mother and her father. She had survived 8 campaigns and a resignation and the long public unraveling of everything she had helped build. And she said that physical therapy, the daily, grinding, unglamorous work of relearning how to use her own body, was the hardest thing she had ever done. This is the sentence that tells you the scale of what she had been carrying. Richard Nixon, for his part, was devastated by the stroke. Whatever the distances that had grown between them, whatever the silences, the managed exclusions, the architecture of secrets that Watergate had revealed, he sat at her bedside through those months with a constancy that her biographers have documented clearly and consistently. He was there. Whatever else he was there. They moved to New York in 1979 to be closer to their daughters and grandchildren. They moved to New Jersey in 1981. Pat had a second stroke in 1983. She developed lung infections. She grew frail in the particular way of someone who has spent decades in motion and finds stillness disorienting. The body unsure at last of what to do with itself. She appeared in public for the opening of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California, in July of 1990. She was 78 years old. Former First Lady Barbara Bush stood nearby and watched her move through the crowd and thought, and later recorded that she thought, that through Pat Nixon's smile, you could see that she was in great pain and having a terrible time getting air into her lungs. She was smiling anyway. Of course she was. Here is the thing about Pat Nixon that the label Plastic Pat was never able to account for. She was voted Most Admired Woman in America 14 times. 14. Not by the press, which had decided early who she was and never fully revised its verdict. By the people. The ordinary Americans who stood in line to shake her hand, who watched her hold the hands of the sick and the grieving, who received her handwritten thank you notes and kept them, who saw in her something the cameras consistently failed to capture. She had expanded the role of First Lady in ways that her successors built upon, without always knowing the foundation they were standing on. She had traveled to combat zones and earthquake sites and leprosy wards. She had added 600 works of art to the White House while no one was paying attention to anything but Watergate. She had done the work, all of it, without press releases and without credit and without anyone asking her how she was holding up. History, as it was written in the years immediately following her death, did not linger on any of this. History remembered Nixon and Watergate and the resignation and the helicopter. History remembered the double V sign at the door of Marine One. History moved on. Pat Nixon died at home in Park Ridge, New Jersey on June 22, 1993. It was one day after her 53rd wedding anniversary. Richard Nixon was with her. He sobbed at her funeral, openly, completely, in a way that those who had known him for decades said they had never seen from him before. He had not cried like this in public. Not during Watergate. Not during the resignation. Not during any of the defeats and humiliations of a long and turbulent public life. He sobbed for his wife, in the church, without dignity, without composure, without the walls. She had earned that, at least. He survived her by 10 months, dying on April 22, 1994. He is buried beside her in the rose gardens of the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda. The same California soil she had come from, the same ground her father had farmed, the same place she had always, in some deep part of herself, been trying to return to. Her epitaph, chosen by her family, reads, "Even when people can't speak your language, they can tell if you have love in your heart." She had said this once about her travels, about what it meant to sit with people across every barrier of language and culture and circumstance, and make them feel seen. It was the truest thing she ever said about herself. It was also, perhaps, the truest explanation for why the press never quite understood her. The press spoke her language. It simply could not tell if she had love in your heart. The people who could not speak her language knew immediately. May 18th. There is a rose named after her. A French horticultural company developed it in 1972, during the years when she was First Lady and the world was still deciding what to make of her. They named it the Pat Nixon rose. It is deep red, almost black at the center, opening gradually to a warmer crimson at the edges. It blooms in the rose gardens of the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, California, planted in the ground above where she is buried. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. Richard Nixon wrote to her every day for 14 months during the war. He numbered the letters so she would know if one went missing. She saved every single one of them, all of them, for 50 years, through the campaigns and the defeats and the White House and Watergate and the strokes and the slow receding of everything that had once been large and loud and consuming. She saved the letters. After she died, her husband could not speak about her without breaking. The man who had held himself together through the worst political scandal in American history, who had resigned the presidency and walked to a helicopter and flown away without publicly shedding a single tear. That man wept at his wife's funeral in a way that no one who was present ever forgot. 10 months later, he was gone too. Historians, in the years since, have begun the slow work of revision. The biographies have grown more careful, more complete. The archives at the Nixon Library have opened. The personal papers, the letters, the schedules, the memos, the small daily evidence of a life have become available to researchers who approach them without the noise of the 1970s distorting everything they see. What they find, consistently, is a woman who was more than the story told about her. More traveled, more politically astute, more genuinely beloved by foreign leaders, by ordinary citizens, by the staff of every residence she ever occupied, than the public record had preserved. A woman who held views that were, in many respects, ahead of her time, and held them quietly, because the cost of holding them loudly was a cost she would have been left to pay alone. A woman who knew, somewhere in the private rooms of herself, what was being sacrificed, and sacrificed it anyway. Not because she had no choice. She had made choices all along. To stay, to campaign, to smile, to endure. She had chosen Richard Nixon on a California evening in 1940, with her eyes open, and she had honored that choice through everything that followed. What she could not have chosen, what no one chooses, was what the choice would cost. Her daughter Julie once asked her, in the years after San Clemente, whether she had regrets. The answer Pat gave has not been fully recorded. What has been recorded is that she did not answer quickly, that she looked, for a moment, at something beyond the room. And then she said what she had always said, in one form or another, across all the years of cameras and campaigns and cloth coats and red carpets. That she believed in him. That she was proud. That she had no complaints. Whether that was the whole truth, whether any answer given after 50 years of learning to compose your face for the watching world can ever be the whole truth, is something only Pat Nixon knew. She took that with her, into the California ground, under the deep red roses. Into the silence she had always been better at than anyone gave her credit for.